pure profit to run out of control and become a system that's unsustainable and is just inevitably going to collapse.
Is capitalism, or rather our mostly capitalist but mixed market system, the quote-unquote enemy of Occupy Wall Street? If so, why have all the other historical attempts at command economies or more structured economies, from Sovietism to the soft socialism of Europe's welfare states, been less than successful or a failure?
Well, first of all, I should have said at the beginning. I don't speak for Occupy Wall Street as a whole. Nobody does. It's not a movement that operates that way. So I don't want my answer to be taken as something that's. I'll try to answer for as broadly as possible. I can answer for myself personally, but on the whole, Occupy Wall Street's a broad movement and contains a lot of different viewpoints. So there's certainly some people within Occupy Wall Street who don't throw out the whole system of capitalism and would like to see, as I described earlier, a form of capitalism that's a little bit more what I would call humane, a more social justice-oriented capitalism where people are still rewarded for their entrepreneurship, but there's certain restrictions in place. Some people certainly are in favor of that. Other people in Occupy Wall Street see capitalism as inherently exploitative and therefore bad. As far as the command economy, I mean, the Soviet Union is not the goal. I think that's pretty universally. I shouldn't say that, but a lot of people agree the Soviet Union isn't the goal. There's certainly some people who still want something like that, but I don't think that's the majority. A lot of us on the left learned from the Soviet collapse, and a lot of us on the left had some problems with the Soviet Union before it collapsed too. That's not the goal. But that doesn't. The Soviet failure doesn't mean that designing an economy around degrees of equality and around social justice and around community is irrelevant. That experiment failed, but that doesn't mean that the principles are wrong. In the same way that if you pointed out flaws in left-wing governments in today's world, like Cuba or Venezuela, that doesn't invalidate the principles those countries claim to stand for. And as far as the other, the countries in Europe go, there's degrees of social, I guess what you call welfare states in Europe, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to comment on their success or failure. The European Union is an interesting experiment on the whole, and they're facing certain challenges. I'm not sure those challenges are necessarily to do with the more socialistic countries in the EU, like Sweden or Denmark. But again, I might not be the best person to talk about that in detail.
Okay, so we'll skip the next question about Europe and the welfare states there if you don't.
Oh no, I mean fire away. If I'm uncomfortable answering, I just.
But before we get there, I have to ask a question that's not on the list.
Okay.
There's a term that I've heard a lot from the left, and that you brought up, and sometimes it's been used very aggressively. Sometimes it's been used as sort of you were using it amorphously. What do you mean when you say social justice?
By social justice, I mean, okay, so it depends on usage, for sure. When I'm saying a system designed around social justice, I guess what I mean is solidarity. A system that takes into account human needs. Over other things. So, I mean, social justice usually is used in contrast to something that's going on now. So it implies there's injustice, social injustice, and we want justice. I would agree with that in terms of the movements we're trying to build. When there's for example racism in the legal system, we say we want social justice. We want a better form of justice than that. But when I talk about a potential society involving principles of social justice, I mean taking into account everyone's human needs.
So would social justice, would that rubric involve environmentalism or just purely, human, interhuman relations?
Absolutely.
Person to person, right?
Absolutely, it would involve environmentalism because environmentalism has a lot to do with human needs. I mean, we need healthy environment around us. I don't know too many people who want to live wearing a gas mask in a bubble on a moonscape. We need a healthy, strong environment because we're part of the Earth. We need that to be healthy.
Good. So on the topic of environment and environmental regulation, assuming that global warming is a man-made occurrence, if China and India, as well as other nations, have no desire to curtail their lightning speed economic growth with green regulations, why should America, why should the U.S. workers artificially slow our economy and send our economy further into stagnation by sending jobs overseas where there's less workplace regulation, less workplace protection, and less environmental protection?
Well, you know what else China does? They jail political dissidents, and
both sides of the aisle are against that.
Right.
We agree on that. Yes.
Yeah, and arguably that it makes their state stronger. I mean, they don't have to deal with the same level of protest. I mean, they don't have to deal with the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street. They'll just lock people up. And I think we'd both agree that's not a good idea, even though it might make their state stronger, at least in the short term. I don't think we have to be concerned necessarily with what they do on that level. I mean, as far as India, parts of India, I just read a study recently that in parts of India are so corrupt that that paying off the DMV gets you a driver's license quicker and cheaper than actually taking the test. And you could make the argument that our society is stifled by government regulation of driving ages, but I think that we can agree that there's certain areas that are sensible to have government regulation of, like driving ages or maybe drinking ages, and I would put environmental protection in that category. If we in the USA understand that pollution's a bad thing, and you mentioned that if we assume that global warming is a man-made thing, whether or not it's man-made and whether or not pollution, it's like it's intuitive. Forget it. There's plenty of science to back up, I think, that global warming is a man-made thing. But either way, intuitively, if you go to some of these factories and you see just mountains of toxic glop being dumped into fresh waterways, or factories where there's volcanoes of toxic gas shooting into our air, that can't be good. So if we understand that these things are bad, then in the USA here, we should be leaders and we should go ahead and regulate those things, and not worry about what countries like China or India are doing. We should do it here because we know it's the right thing to do, and we should put pressure on them if we take it seriously, economically, politically, through international institutions like the UN or others. We should put pressure on them to follow our lead.
So brass tacks, even if it means more jobs going overseas, it's still the right thing to do, you're saying?
So in short, yes. But I think there's also other ways to try to keep jobs here also. I'm not saying I'm in favor of sending all our jobs to those countries. I don't think we should be sending jobs to countries that have no labor laws or no environmental laws either. But yeah, I think it's important. I think environmental regulation is very important, and there's a clock ticking on our planet's survival that way. So it's important to get done.
So on a related issue, one that has some turmoil on the left side of the aisle, that sort of pits organized labor against the environmental lobby, and I think is a little bit more specific than just the general vision of environmentalism. The Keystone oil pipeline. Considering there's already a currently existing pipeline from Canada to Oklahoma and Illinois, and that expanding the pipeline to Texas and I believe Louisiana, like branches off and goes to Louisiana, considering that that's supported by unions and organized labor, but opposed by the environmental movement, I was wondering where you stood on the issue.
Yeah, it's complicated. There are a lot of unions that support that because their main interest is keeping good jobs for their members. But also, there's Canadian unions oppose that because it means a loss of jobs in Canada. So there's also a push and pull there. But again, there are a lot of